recordings of progress. For your convenience, everyone, we are probably only 2 weeks away this week and then next week from concluding our book on dangerous religious ideas. And what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, and that is give you some time to consider whether you want to join us for the next text we'll be reading, and that's John Shelby Spong's Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. I misspoke last time. I was calling it fundamentalism, but I thought just so we're all on the same page, I'd show you a picture of the book. I've already ordered it, and it's sitting on my table at home, just waiting to be cracked open. And I don't know how we all order books. I think we all just do it individually, but if you want to be part of that study next time, the next book study, I will allow you to, or I will suggest that you order this book or get it from your local bookseller, or however you like to do that. Any questions about that?
Can you give us an overview?
An overview of the book? Okay, well, I think, Mac, have you read it, or do you just?
I just finished rereading it last week.
Oh, you did? Mac, can you give us an overview? Do you mind?
Oh, no, I guess not. The theory is basically in the title, and he claims that we really have never understood Christianity and the early writings because we've lost the ability to view it through Jewish eyes.
Right.
And that if you do that, it's a completely different perspective than we had. And what happens is, without Jewish eyes, and we put our Western eyes on it, the language is construed literally. And it has completely different meanings for people. And we've done that forever. You know, by the time we developed all of and he has another book on, why, I guess that's a subtitle here, why Christianity must change or die, is he thinks that it will die if we don't make some revolutionary changes and get away from things like the creeds that were developed 300 and 400 years ago, because people just can't buy that anymore,
right.
and so they reject it. The other thing, before, just to briefly, is that he believes that all of the synoptic gospels are based on an outline of following the Jewish holidays, the liturgical holidays. And for each holiday, in chronological order, although they have to start, they have to end with Passover at the crucifixion. But then after that, all of the developments, the birth and infancy narratives, the Sermon on the Mount, all of these things relate to Jewish holidays and Old Testament traditions.
That's interesting. So where does he start with the holidays? I'm assuming Pentecost or Shavuot, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai.
I think there's one right before.
Okay, that's interesting.
Maybe, but he says we have to start with Passover. Right. I mean, the Bible has to end with Passover.
Of course, right.
So, although, I may be misstating that, because then he has the post-resurrection appearances, and I can't recall if he links those to a separate holiday or not. But it's a interesting book.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. It's provocative. It's novel, and I think it'll give you at least a different perspective on New Testament.
I'm going to guess the Gentile heresy is that, with the rise of the influence of Greek philosophy on how to interpret the Bible, especially rhetoric and, Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy, that lends itself to a more literal reading than what Judaism would. Ironically, it's that very literal reading that would, throughout the centuries, eventually come to be the foundation of science as well. And that's where Christians can no longer buy a lot of the Bible because they're trying to read it scientifically, or we might even say literally as well. And for that reason, we have to come up with a new way of looking at Scripture, a new pair of lenses. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what Spong has to say. He's controversial. He's always been controversial. I think he, like John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg and Bart Ehrman, kind of revels in that. But he's also easy to read. Wouldn't you say, Mac? Yeah.
He's way easier to read than the one we're in now. He's writing for, he's not writing for academics. I think he's writing for lay people and clergy.
Right.
And a lot of it, frankly, you know, controversial and all that, but it is kind of New Testament 101. I mean, there's stuff he says in there that I learned or was taught at Hastings College 50 years ago.
Right.
But it's still controversial.
Yeah. You know, it's funny you mentioned that, because I've had so many people say, you know, I really enjoy the afternoon Bible study you do, but I just need to understand the New Testament. I just need to understand the Bible. I don't think I know the whole chronology or the stories. And so I'm thinking about putting together a class, not for us, but for, you know, for anybody who wants to see it and videotape it, or whatever we're doing here, recording it, just simply on the Bible 101. You know, what do you need to know in order to be biblically literate? Because I'm hearing this more and more often these days. People really want to get into these kinds of discussions, but they have to start from square one. So I don't know if you know of people who hear that, who say that, please let me know about that, because maybe we need to address that issue among folks in our church and elsewhere as well. So Constance just joined us. This is the book that we'll be looking at next time. And I'd like to propose that we meet this week and next week, and then we'll conclude with our discussion of mikvah. And then the next Wednesday, which would be March 2nd, is Ash Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. And typically on Ash Wednesday, there are kind of afternoon services, probably around noon, for people to, you know, go to church. At least I seem to remember that's when I'm always going. And so we wouldn't meet on Ash Wednesday, and then we can pick up and start with the book on, start with Spong's book on March 9. And that will give us, you know, a good 3 weeks now to get the book, to buy it, and, you know, maybe start reading a little bit of it. And I will, for the sake of those who find mikvah difficult to read, which includes me, by the way, you know, I'm used to academic writing, but this, you know, I like what she's saying, what she's trying to do, but, you know, there's just a lot of assumed knowledge in this text that really needs to be unpacked. And I can't imagine that it's enjoyable for people who are not used to academic authors. So, but hopefully we've been able to, you know, nevertheless, get some insights from the text itself. Are there any questions or comments about that proposed schedule from not meeting on Ash Wednesday? And please, if you know, this is a pretty august intellectual crowd, but if you know of people who would like to join us, please invite them. I'm glad and so happy we have 2 people in Arizona, one who's lounging in his camper in Texas right now. Is Al still with us, or did we lose him? I didn't remember seeing him. Oh, there he is. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, Al Meyer is on the road in southern Texas, and he's joining us, I presume, from a campground, right, Al? Something like that. But I think that's great. Let me get us started here. The last time we met, we were talking about the idea of election in Islam, and we got to the point of, you know, concluding that chapter. I did want to remind you about one of the mystical poets that is really so important to know about, because each tradition we're looking at, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, has a mystical aspect to it. In Islam, it's called Sufism. And you may know a little bit about the whirling dervishes. But all of these mystical traditions can trace themselves back to what's called the Platonic mystical tradition of Neoplatonism, or at least it's been influenced by Neoplatonism. And that is the idea that ultimately the world is one and held together by an essential divine aspect. I don't want to say it's pantheism, but many people would call it that we can encounter God in the simplest and the most mundane aspects of our experience. And in that encounter, we can come to realize that which makes us different from the other is really kind of an illusion. In fact, deep down inside, we are all working from the same essential nature. We find this in the Jewish Kabbalah. We find this in the Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart and many others I could refer to, St. John of the Cross. And in Sufism, in Islam, it's called Sufism. And it's the poet Rumi who tries to give us intimations of this unified, well, let's call it a spiritual unified field theory of how we live in the world. And so if you ever pick up Rumi's poetry, that is the foundation from which he's working. So I wanted to conclude that chapter with that, just a brief overview of Sufism and Islamic mysticism. Are there any questions that you would like to pose about Rumi? It's very, very popular around Valentine's Day because he essentially writes about love. And of course, love that lies at the source of all of creation, which there's an erotic aspect to God, if I can use that term. Well, I want to, in the next, this discussion and next week, talk about some of the enduring challenges that face these three religious traditions. And I want to do this. There's one aspect of the last 250 years that our author hasn't really discussed, but we can't overlook it, because when it mixes with the tendency of religious traditions to otherize people, if I can use that, the othering that she speaks about, one element has been added since about the beginning of the 19th century, and that is nationalism. Nationalism can often take on the trappings of religious fervor. In fact, I would argue that much of the Christianity that we encounter today on the right has more to do with a fervor or an enthusiasm for national identity over against religious identity. There's kind of a Christian veneer that goes over this nationalism that we see on the religious right. And we find this, and this is where I hope we can have an interesting discussion. We find this in Judaism. We certainly find it in Christianity today, but in Islam, nationalism isn't as much of a focus as what we might call theocracy. And theocracy knows no geographical bounds, but it's the idea of wanting to bring Muslims under the rule of God, under Sharia law, if you will. And we see this most clearly in Iran today under the Ayatollah. But I'll get a chance to talk a little bit about that. But I do want to remind us just about the history of Jewish nationalism, because it arose out of the late 19th century, when questions of nationalism were very big in terms of philosophical discussions, especially in Vienna, Austria. There was a large and a very prominent Jewish community in Vienna. This is where, Sigmund Freud did his work. Martin Buber was there for a while. There was a very strong Jewish theatrical movement, Jewish theater. Hannah Arendt would be there, Walter Benjamin, just a lot of people. There was just a lot of conversation based in philosophical ideas. But there were many Jews that, as a result of the last 100 years, and there's something that happened in France with the First Republic, that Jews were around the first decade of the 19th century, that Jews were all of a sudden granted citizenship in France as a result of the French Revolution, this idea of egalitarianism, right? And Jews were then brought into the fold, so to speak. And many Jews came to really enjoy this notion of, they had been outsiders and now they were going to be insiders, right? And they could enter into into commerce without any kind of restrictions. They could go to universities without any kind of restrictions. It's much of what we claim today in terms of liberal democratic principles. But there still was this underlying anti-Semitism that came to the fore in the late 19th century in France. But throughout that 19th century, many Jews were questioning if maybe they were in a post-Jewish era. And there were many Jews who were saying, I don't want to be religious anymore, but I still want to be Jewish. And there was a movement known as, just a Jewish national movement of Zionism, people wanting to have their own nation, their own geographical place where they could they could exercise their own sense of what it meant to be a nation. So this was known as Jewish nationalism or Zionism, and it became a movement of atheistic Zionists. The movement of going to Israel, of immigrating or emigrating from one country to Israel, really began as an atheistic movement by a man by the name of Theodor Herzl. He was fully on board with all of the Enlightenment ideas and the rise of liberal democracy, and he had set aside his belief in God, but he still had this sense that in order to be truly Jewish, we had to be a nation. So this became all the more acute, this need for immigration to Israel after the Dreyfus affair in France. And this was, you may remember, there was a French army officer by the name of Dreyfus, can't remember his first name, but who was accused of selling state secrets or revealing state secrets to the German embassy. And there was no evidence that he had done this. In fact, he was arrested, I think it was 1894, and a couple of years later, it became clear that he was innocent, and there was another person who all of the evidence suggested had done this, and that person was arrested, but Dreyfus still remained in prison. And there came to be factions in Israel, in France. Some were very pro-Dreyfus. This is a classic example of anti-Semitism. Some, led by the Catholic Church in a kind of a more traditional understanding of French nationalism, were very anti-Dreyfus. Well, eventually Dreyfus was exonerated, but it lasted for a good 10 to 12 years. He was sent to he was sent out of the country, and I can't remember, Guyana, perhaps. But eventually he was exonerated, but it made it very clear that despite all this liberal democratic, talk, anti-Semitism was still a very big problem. You can make a law that made it illegal to discriminate against somebody based upon their ethnic heritage, but morally, people still held these views. because of this, it made it all the clearer that if Jews were truly going to be Jews, they needed their own place. And this is when immigration or Zionism came to the fore. Some Jews emigrated from their countries to Palestine. At that time, it was known as Palestine. Others wanted to remain and make a go of it. And this was very tragic in places like Poland and Germany, when Jews had the opportunity to leave, seeing all the telltale signs of fascism on the rise, but they did not, and they ended up being victimized in the concentration camps during World War II. So let me stop, and I hope I'm not giving you history that you already know, but it's really important that we understand Israel today as having this early conception. It was meant to be a liberal democratic state with no connections to religion, but only an ethnic identity. But it has not become that. Are there any questions or comments, especially from those who've recently been to Israel/Palestine?
Dan?
Yeah, Denny.
I think you can see the legacy of Theodore Herzl immediately after the independence of Israel in 1947.
Right.
With the selection of David Ben-Gurion and the rise of the kibbutzim and the coming out of the European experience of Christian socialism, or whatever you want to call it, secular socialism.
Yep.
Of a European variety, not to be confused with, the Russian variety. And that extends almost all the way to what you're going to have on this, what you have on the screen here, to 1967 and the Six-Day War. The mention of the Holocaust was almost forbidden
Right.
in Israel until the Six-Day War. And then all of a sudden, it was this total fear on the part of Jewish settlers and Israeli citizens at that point, that it was going to be repeated all over again.
Right. You set up my next couple of slides very nicely, because we, after World War II, a Jewish provisional government was set up in Israel by the United Nations. And this happened in 1947, the Jewish Partition Plan, where you had proposed Jewish state, which is seen here in blue. And then I'm sorry, I need to go back. Sorry about that. And then down here, you have the proposed Arab state, which is seen in this, I guess, beige color here. It was not long after that, provisional government that was set up in June of the next year, there was an Arab invasion. Syria, Jordan, Egypt tried to overtake this and, tried to wipe out this whole idea of an Israeli government. That was the June 1948, I guess we'd call it conquest, but interestingly enough, the Jews fought back, and they basically, by July, within the period of a month, had chased the Arabs back to their respective countries, which led to some very open questions about, okay, we've chased the Arabs away, but now what do we do with this Jewish state? Should we try to chase them out their, the territory that has been identified by the United Nations as being theirs? And that idea has persisted now for 80 years, right? It's very clear that the Arabs don't want us here based upon this 1948 invasion. Then maybe as the best defense is a good offense. I want to definitely, Denny, I want to call on you, because I know that you follow this all the time. You know, you're always sending me articles from Haaretz. By the way, the name Haaretz means the land. This is the name of the newspaper in Israel. But it shows just how important this geographical conquest and holding on to territory really is. It's just in the mind of so many people. Denny, do you want to, or anyone else, do you want to mention anything about this 1948 travesty that took place? Because it really is going to set the stage for what transpires in the next 80 years.
Well, as I recall, by July of 1948, the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, had managed to displace or kill around 700,000 Palestinians. And this is just replicating history, you know, for a long time, that it's, call it ethnic cleansing or whatever you want to call it, but a manifest destiny, as it goes on and on. You have to remember that many of the leadership, much of the leadership had come out of the British Army. Jews who were officers in the British Army or non-commissioned officers in the British Army during World War II, then immediately immigrated to Palestine.
Right.
And their training was very evident. Superior training was very evident and experienced during World War II.
Sure.
And that's why, as you mentioned, the 1 month in there between 1940 in June and July was so critical in establishing the state of Israel.
Right.
So then you get into Deborah Gerner's, one land, two nations dilemma that is still with us. And I'm not sure there is going to be any peaceful resolution of this ever.
Right. Well,
Dan,
yeah, go
Dan?
ahead, please.
Well, just to add to what Denny said, one of the strongest impressions for me on our trip was all the walls and barbed wire. I mean, it was just everywhere.
Right.
And then the other impression, we were in Galilee and we looked across to the Golan Heights, which is still staunchly defended by the Israelis.
Right.
With
Right.
all kinds of, I'm sure, drones and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. And that came about as a result of the 6-Day War, which is the next slide I want to show.
Good.
Before the 6-Day War in 1966, you have to also imagine what this is doing to the psyche of a people who for several thousand years have been on the outside, right? Have been unjustly treated, have been seen as the other, have been eliminated through pogroms. And in short order, it's attempted in 1947, and they basically rout out the enemy. As Denny was saying, you've got all of these, Israeli, or I should say Jewish at this point, Jewish officers who have been trained as a result of World War II, fighting Arabs who are fighting probably in ways that are traditional to the Middle East and have not been tested by World War II. And they rout them, but it just probably solidifies in the Jewish mind, look, this may be a new state for us, but times have not changed. And so emphasis upon defense, the best defense is a good offense, as Denny was saying, killing 700,000 Palestinians as a result of that, that 1948 war it was kind of adding insult to injury or going above where they really needed to go. Palestinians weren't necessarily the enemy here. So, but in
No, the
19
British were.
I'm sorry?
The British were. They forbade the Palestinians to arm themselves
Yeah,
from the time the British had the mandate in about 1920 or so. And they didn't let them arm, but Americans smuggled arms to the immigrants from Europe regularly. And it was New York Judaism, which was really financing and sabotaging the Palestinians.
yeah. Now we're beginning to see how complex this is and why there's such a strong connection between the United States and Israel.
Dan,
Yes, go ahead.
should have been an obvious question. I just don't know my history. So when the UN set up the provisional government and determined who was going to own what, who in the UN? I mean, which countries were involved? How did that come about? And were the Palestinians, the people that actually lived there, were they ever part of the discussion?
No.
You know,
I mean,
that's,
certainly not, but I don't know.
well, just remember the context as well. World War II ends, but all the British colonies, look at what else happens. Look at what happens in India. You've got Gandhi, who are able to wrest India back from the hands of the British. The British had all they could do to pay for World War II. And so they were giving up their colonized regions like hand over fist, right? And this question, okay, and it was the British did support the Rothschild. A lot of this goes back to the Baron von Rothschild, Baron Rothschild, who wanted to establish a homeland in Israel, and they gave a lot of money through that. And of course, you know, he was a British citizen as well. And so there's that connection that goes on here. But I couldn't give you a list of the countries that were in the United Nations at the time, but I would guess the general council, I can't remember the name of it. But
General Assembly and the Security Council.
Security Council, right? That's what I'm talking about. They tried to, you know, partition things in a way that, okay, this is going to work. But look at this. If you want to go back to that map, this beige area with the city at Jerusalem, which actually is going to be administered internationally, right?
Right.
But Jews want Jerusalem. I mean, that is the source of their whole identity. But in the middle of this, you know, Palestinian occupied or Arab occupied state, you know, that was going to cause problems. And even today, Jerusalem is partitioned, you know, in 4 different areas. So I think Jordan actually has control over, or has administrative control over Jerusalem today. But this is where I'm going to have to rely upon my scholars who are with me to correct me on this.
I think Jordan gave up all administration after they got clobbered by Israel in one of the wars later.
In
And
1960
I don't think Jordan has any authority at all in the old
Dwight,
house.
Dwight,
Yeah.
could I add something to that? I think Jordan still maintains a military force at the Dome of the Rock
right.
to protect
Oh, do
that,
they?
protect that holy site. We saw numerous Jordanian military up on the Dome of the Rock while we were
Yeah.
there. And
Well, let's bring it into the 21st century. The Dome of the Rock is in a Muslim dominated or Muslim controlled area, which
yes,
is really, really interesting. Because when you go into the other side of the Wailing Wall, that's the Jewish quarter. And so this question, especially now as Israel becomes, in Jerusalem especially, becomes more and more right wing and more conservative with ultra orthodox ideas controlling the minds of you know, the government. The question of will the Dome of the Rock remain in Muslim hands is one that is constantly, it's like a match getting ready to light a tinderbox. But let's back up to the 1967. The so-called Six-Day War, it was basically a reenactment of what happened 20 years earlier. And that is when the Arab coalition of Syria, Jordan, and Egypt attempted to invade Israel and, of course, annihilate them. Somehow Israel found out about this and was able to launch a preemptive attack. And as a result of that, came to occupy, here's the pre-Six-Day War map. Right here, this orange region, or whatever color that, this beige region is Arab occupied territories, with blue being Israel. But now Israel, after the Six-Day War, takes over the Sinai Peninsula, all the way up into the Golan Heights, occupies the West Bank of the Jordan. Look over here on the left hand, that was occupied by Muslims prior to that, and now is occupied by Israel. And much of the peace negotiations that have taken place since that time have centered around trying to wrest back into Arab control some of the land that was gained in 1967. You might remember Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin meeting with Jimmy Carter with the Israeli peace agreement. That gave the Sinai Peninsula back to the Arabs. But you still have this question of the so-called occupied West Bank and the occupied Golan Heights, and Israel expanding and taking Palestinian land and trying to establish settlements there. And that's the source of a lot of the conflict. So all of this, to put it in the context of our book, this othering still goes on, but I want to add to this an extra bit of powder to the keg, and that's ideas of nationalism, which are really secular ideas, on top of religious nationalism. And it creates an even more volatile situation, because now you have religious nationalism that is fueling the fire. Somebody please add to this history for me, if you would, please. Anybody, or questions?
I kind of remember that in 1945, there were 60,000 Jewish people in that area and 4 million Arabs. And that's when they decided of what to do with all these Jewish people who had been in concentration camps and elsewhere. And they put on boats and started a huge immigration into this volatile area where there were very few Jews at the time. And what we've seen then was a wresting of this, which the British didn't allow the Arabs to ever arm themselves. So they had no ability to turn back what were essentially invaders into what had been their country for 800 years.
Right.
And so, it was a point at which everybody's sympathy for the Jewish community, from the horrors they had gone through in Europe, they said, well, let the Arabs pay off the horror we Europeans created for them. It was a really bad decision to.
Right.
Let's say somebody decided that Americans, having invaded this continent only 300 or 400 years ago,
Right.
And should they be allowed to be shoved out because of somebody's historic claims to the territory, and we watch us use a principle about, well, this is their homeland because they were there 2,000 years ago. That means I ought to be able to take the Rhine territory. you know, because
Yeah.
my ancestors were there for a long time.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a morass in that respect, and so complex. And again, because the nationalism is added almost as an extra spice to the whole mix as well. Kathy,
Well, and I don't know if it's nationalism, but this is gonna be my viewpoint as being growing up during the 50s and 60s and loving Paul Newman and movies. And so you have things like for the general populace who don't know dilly squat really what's going on that much. I mean, we kind of know about the Middle East, but we don't know like what you have shown here, I don't think generally. And so you have those movies with the powerful music and the great production and that we are behind those, and everything that had happened to the Jews during the Holocaust, that it wasn't until the later 60s for me that all of a sudden people that were kind of against the Vietnam War, some of those folks were actually speaking in a positive way about the Arabs. And that was like, I remember really being kind of blindsided because I was remembering the movie Exodus and you know what I mean? And there was some way that America was being fed, not that it was bad or good, but that nationalism seemed to be coming through in different ways that the average American had access to, that maybe, you know, they didn't do other things.
well, and there is still in the church on the right, conservative churches, this sense that the history of Israel is somehow tied up with the messianic claims of Christianity. Now, Israel has its own messianic tradition as well that plays into this on into the future, past after 1947. But, you know, this connection that somehow Christian evangelicalism and the nation of Israel and Israel's national sovereignty go hand in hand in order to set the conditions for the possibility of the return of Christ. That also plays into it as well. I haven't gone through all the photos here. Does anybody else want to ask a question or jump in?
Dan, the 6-Day War was so short because it was almost a replay of 1948.
Right.
Because the Israelis really deeply understood the technology of modern warfare, and particularly jet fighter planes and how you could use them. And they literally decimated the entire Egyptian Air Force
Right.
in a matter of hours on the ground.
Yeah.
They never got off the ground. And the same thing would be true of artillery, rockets, all of the modern weaponry that was available in, 1967.
Right.
So Moshe Dayan and the Israeli military really come out of that, with, far heightened social status.
Right. As well as a sense of maybe, this is like the people coming out of the desert in Joshua and fighting these huge Canaanites. This is David and Goliath, And so when you start to recapitulate these Jewish stories that lie at the heart of Jewish identity, it lends itself to this idea of, hey, maybe this is the time when the Messiah is going to come. So then you get messianic expectations tied up with the nation of Israel. And there are those who, are going to promote this and promoting it right up to the very present as well. Any other comments? It's a great discussion.
Not a comment, I have a question, and probably either Dan or Denny or anybody else would know. I guess I don't. So in the 60s, or maybe even prior to, Denny, who was actually in a geopolitical sense, who was supporting who? I'm assuming it was more Western folks were supporting Israel, and then was there a tie? I don't know. from Russia and some of the others to support the, how was that playing out? I have no idea.
To the best of my memory, Kathy, the Europeans out of guilt, particularly Germany, and the United States. I think the United States out of guilt, because if you look at their record during World War II,
Yeah, yeah,
it was atrocious. I mean, turning Jews back, that arriving in New York City, to, to one-way trip to Auschwitz.
right,
The Russians, on the other hand, were very, very active, in Egyptian politics, and the hangover of that, if you will, the spillover, is still being seen today in terms of Russia's military presence in Syria and what they're
Right.
doing to the Syrian people.
yeah,
One factor in this has been a propaganda machine which has operated to make 6 million dead Jews a real a byword in everybody's language. What everybody forgets is there were 18.5 million Russian citizens, or rather Soviet citizens, died in that war. And a total of 55,000 or 55 million died in the whole war. And those figures are never cited, but everybody knows 6 million. And you ask most people, how many people died in World War II? They'll say 6 million.
that's right. And we,
In
now we get
in
it.
other words, we've had a propaganda machine which drilled this into us. And those 6 million, many of them died in the concentration camps, but they also probably double count the Jews who died in Soviet Russia, because that was one of the things the Germans did, was line up the Jews in the cities they invaded and execute them. So that when we talk about these figures that are shiftable as to who and where and what was happening. And that was such a wonderful propaganda tool that made us all side immediately then with these people need a refuge
Right.
to be saved. So that was a great propaganda coup, which we've never looked past and really recognized that there were 4 million people and 60,000 people. And we don't say anything about the 4 million, which have now I think become more like 8 million. I'm not sure what the population is now of the Palestinians who are being encouraged to get out of there and leave it all to the immigrants.
Right, right. And then you have the difficult situation that we find ourselves in. I don't support the nation of Israel as a liberal democratic government and their policies, but that doesn't make me anti-Semitic. There are many who will suggest, oh, yes, it does. And
yes,
this is
what silence our opposition to their encroachments has been is that we will seem to be anti-Semitic rather than just anti-Israeli, which is
Right.
a different genre.
And thankfully, there are many progressive Jews, primarily in New York and primarily in the Reform and Reconstructionist movement, who've pointed this out, that if the messianic mission is that of the people and not of one person, and that is to repair the world, tikkun olam is the Hebrew word, then the policies of current Israel, especially under Netanyahu, are in stark contradiction to that. And and I'm trying to point out the other side of the equation. This is not all Jews who are supporting Israel. There are many Jews that want to support the Jewish vocation of being of living true humanity and revealing that to the world. But when it gets caught up with, the nationalist policies of Israel, then it just, that creative aspect of God's covenant with God's people based in love and understanding and pluralism gets completely eclipsed. But there are Jews today who are trying to walk this very thin line, criticizing Israel, but still trying to be very, very positively supportive of the Jewish tradition itself. Other comments about this or questions? This is great. I love this, the fact that we're all thinking along these lines. I can't even remember what my next slide is. Well, I think I'm just going to stay with Israel today. No, I think we've gotten through everything I wanted to talk about here. And if there isn't, I thought maybe I should talk a little bit about the control of the Temple Mount. We did touch upon that, but for those who may not know, this structure here is called the Dome of the Rock. And it is built precisely over the place where the Holy of Holies of the last Jewish temple, which was destroyed in 587, once stood. And so when Jews want to reclaim their kind of religious identity and they want to worship the way that Jews did prior to the destruction of, the second temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. The first was destroyed in 587. But so much of Jewish identity centered around the temple. This is where sacrifices took place. This is where people would come for Passover to celebrate the Passover. Now that central aspect of Jewish experience is no longer possible because the Dome of the Rock, this Muslim shrine, the third holiest shrine in all of Islam, is believed that Muhammad ascended to heaven on his so-called night journey from this spot. And there he had, conversations with Moses and Jesus and God, and they were giving him advice on how to, start the religion of Islam. That is now controlled by Muslims. And during the 6-Day War, and this is really interesting because cooler heads were able to prevail. During the 6-Day War, when the Jewish army took back this territory, they had the option, and they almost did, blow this up, blow this to pieces. And supposedly, if I understand the history correctly, it was Ben Gurion who said, no, we cannot do this. This is not going to solve any problems. But there are still those today among the ultra-Orthodox and far right wing of the Jewish tradition that would like to see the temple built precisely on this spot. And there are Christian evangelicals that would like to see the temple rebuilt on this precise spot. And therefore, based upon just that idea, they support Israel. We want to see that temple built. So what, Denny, do you want to add anything to that, or anybody else?
I'd like to say that that temple was built in the 9th century.
Right.
That's older than any cathedral in Europe. Now, what
Right.
would we think of blowing up cathedrals in Europe?
Yeah.
It's really one of the oldest still functioning buildings in the world, and a real international treasure in that sense.
Yeah, built during the Abbasid Caliphate, I believe. And it was, this tradition developed around it of this was a holy place that Muhammad came to, which lends itself to, Muhammad knew that this was the place of the Jewish temple, which lends itself to the support of the pluralism that we find in Islam that Mikvah has pointed out. But you're right, Dwight. Chartres Cathedral was still 400 years in the making when this shrine was built. And today it is only, if I'm not mistaken, everyone can visit the shrine, but Jews are not allowed to pray in the precincts of that shrine. So they can go to the Temple Mount, but this is where the Jordanian soldiers come in, right? Denny, I believe.
Yes.
They're on the lookout for Jews with their prayer books opening, wanting to pray on the spot at the temple. That is forbidden. And that is, the source of a lot of contention in Israel right now. Denny, you got your mic open, or did you want to say something? Oh, doesn't look that way. All right. Well, would anybody like to have the last word? There have been a lot of great words coming through, that's for sure. And
Can I just say this?
yeah,
Thank you. This has been, for me, very helpful in not in simplistically, but in simple, linear ways and explanation. Denny and Dwight, I really, really appreciate your input too. I just learned a lot. So thank you, Dan. That would be my last word. Thank you.
yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, and
Thank you.
it's far more complex, and trying to make it simple is very difficult because there are so many players, as Denny and Dwight have pointed out. There's so many players that are involved with this that I'm going to leave something out for sure. But when we return next time, I would like to talk about the second part of our last chapter, or second to the last chapter, the enduring challenges that continue with Islam. And if our conversation goes on as enthusiastically as it did today, we may have to still meet on Ash Wednesday. But
Okay.
we'll talk about that. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So thank you, everyone. It's always the highlight of my week. Smack
Well, thank
dab
you
in the
very
middle of the weekdays, And so,
Thanks for doing this.
yeah. And Al, thanks for joining us. All the way from down in Texas. And of course, Kathy and Joyce, appreciate seeing you all. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Yep.